Her vision held itself against opposed understandings. One where her arms felt too long, her voice too gruff, like she was piloting a body, some organic corpse. A flesh prison that everyone recognized as himself. And the worst part? They called that protein and calcium contraption a name that she was supposed to recognize, identify as herself. And two, all she could be. Glowing skin, a wry smile, fluttering lashes, and a lightning determination brewing in her soul. Escaped from her prison and incarcerated no more, a rebellion of feeling and flesh, of mind and matter, against a construct so poisonous to herself that each spoonful of lies she had to digest, produce, expel forth in the form of clothing, voice, and physicality was tantamount to ingesting nerve agent. If she wasn't so dissociated, she might have screamed. Z stared out the window of their apartment at the wall of traffic backed up against the force of protests. It wasn't much. 4 walls, what could only legally be defined as a window, AC that somehow made the place hotter, and floors so stiff you'd almost wish they weren't there. Sitting up against the windowsill, the combatants became more clear. Not far from the Planned Parenthood, big star-spangled flags and banners promoting conspiracies against trans and other queer folks stood, along with white men dressed in khakis, matching blue shirts and white face coverings. A swarm of less uniformed middle-aged people stood with them, yelling, "Go home, groomers!" and the like. Opposing them was Zer. Well, not Zerself specifically, but a gathering of queer people. People in all black handing out waters and umbrellas, all at the entrance to the facility. They kept the walkway open for patients to come and go, meanwhile keeping the people attacking the health institution and their community at bay. Zer couldn't help but feel like maybe Z should be out there with them. After all, wasn't it Zer they were protecting? Z laid down in their bed and shuddered at the fear the thought elicited. But inside, a quiet excitement began to bubble to the surface. "We protect us!" could be heard outside the window. Yes, we do indeed. Z put on a mask and a sweater and stormed outside. They stared down at their hands, freshly washed of pink hair dye. "Treat yourself," their therapist had said. So they had. A little colored hair to go with the pronouns, a hella good look. As they smiled half-heartedly at the thought, some leftover bleach and hair dye stung a series of bandaged slash marks on their wrist. The therapist had also said, self-harm isn't a healthy way to cope. 1 out of 2 ain't bad, I guess, they thought. As mad at themselves as they were for giving in to the numbness again, they couldn't help but be proud and worried about their friend. And Z had apparently joined a protest the other day. Thank fuck they didn't get hurt. Look at you go, they thought. Finally standing up for yourself. They'd recently begun protesting too, and couldn't help but beam through the depression some faded joy. It takes a lot to stand tall in the face of fuck. Well, that's what it was. Eradication. As he stared down at their arm, still stained of hair dye, blood, and the National Lawyers Guild number, their fists clenched tightly. It hadn't been too long ago they'd considered themselves Christian, their only aspirations being to get married, have 2.5 children, and homeschool them. A docile, medicated wife to an ambitious man of God. That last thought brought a small laugh out of him. Now they were more on a fuck the church vibe. They weren't any more physically impressive than they were before. But at least they had a functioning heart and soul now. As they got up to wash their hands and clean their cuts, they thought about how life had taken them here. No, how they had taken life here. A single answer broke the silence, slipping from their lips. Why? Because what does it mean to be queer? While the question perhaps asks of us to inquire more than there are answers for, there are underlying currents which provide a through line in the queer experience. These currents, resistance, dignity, and communality, provide a framework which ebbs and flows through the queer community, presenting itself in so many of our tendencies. The first one I shall speak of is resistance. To be queer is to rebel against patriarchy. From a young age, we are taught by our society, for mine it's the United States, that love is between one man and one woman, that gender is between man and woman and is chosen for you by nature of your anatomical sex. We are taught that the course of our lives must involve romance, sex, and birthing. We are taught that if we defy these strictures, we will, at best, be seen as aberrant, ill, and unreasonable. At worst, we will be seen as a threat that must be eliminated. The normative experience of the cisgender, heterosexual, and alloromantic monogamous person is to not encounter the forces of conformity with nearly the same biting cut as a person who diverges from these norms. Because they cannot intuit what that is like, it is difficult for them to develop an empathy for those who experience it. In fact, many are taught that to be divergent from patriarchal norms is worthy of ridicule and cruelty, that we are, in some sense, less than human. And for some of them, that sense is the literal kind. Consent is seen by many as bothersome at best, dangerous at worst. This is the environment a queer youth finds themselves predominantly growing up in. Our refuge from the storm found in those who simply do not fit in or who actively defy the conventions of authority. This structure, patriarchy, that we grow up in is built as a hierarchy, and queer people are at the bottom of it. When we are seen, we are brutalized. When we are not, we are fetishized. This system is enforced first in the parent-child hierarchy, wherein divergence is in many households met with discipline and punishment. Then in friend circles, as other youths, beginning to perceive the power dynamics of society, begin to mirror them in their friend circles and beyond. To put it simply, when it comes to existing, queers need not apply. But this does not tell us a full story, and indeed it shouldn't, because our queer experience is not only defined by our oppression, but our reactions to it and our pursuit of, like any other individual, joy. Resistance is not a matter of simply putting up with and surviving brutality, but a matter of thriving in spite of it. And to that end, there is a sincerity to be found in queer spaces that doesn't exist anywhere else, where people can meet and intuit key aspects of another's lived experience because they too have lived it. The motto of queer spaces is diversity and fluidity. Although many of us carry the scars of abuse and at times replicate it, the predominant narrative within the queer community is to be ourselves, to be better than the torture chambers many of us have languished in, to seek love to the best of our abilities. In those spaces, the community becomes stronger than the bonds of the nuclear family. We find ourselves laughing hysterically, sharing stories, and forming entirely new social relations free from our would-be captors. And that isn't to say that it's not without its downfalls. There are many divisions within the community, between young and old queer people, between usage of the word queer in the first place. The validity of some identities like asexuality are still not universally accepted even there, much to my own chagrin. These deserve their own video and will be touched on in the future. These conditions which we find ourselves in lead to a community practice built around the deconstruction of patriarchy. As well, given that patriarchy finds itself enmeshed thoroughly in the social fabric of society, the queer expression of resistance finds itself to be intersectional in its analysis and action. That is to say, we are compelled not merely to fight against patriarchy, but the entire system in our attempts to be free from it. This potential may not find itself fulfilled in all sections of the community, and in fact many struggle to deal with the internal contradictions of white supremacy, capitalism, and state power. But the tendency towards rebellion is there, as a fundamental reality of having to exist while queer in a society which deems us worthy of annihilation. But this explains to us the properties of a community built around resistance, and cannot fully describe to us why the queer community is the way it is. To find those answers, we must look to what that resistance is for. The answer? Dignity. The ability to be proud of ourselves and each other, to find comfort in our existence, to honor the versions of ourselves we know we can be. Our compulsion towards dignity emerges like in any oppressed group, in contrast to our undignified conditions. Because of how common it is for families to be unsupportive of our social transitions and identities, we tend towards communality, a kinship structure built around found family and collective existence rather than genetic family and nuclear existence. This tendency showcases just one material reality which emerges as a positive program designed to enable us to be successful in the pursuit of our own self-actualization. This communality emphasizes our individuality and indeed requires it. It is not, however, a sacrificial act. The collective is not destroyed in that pursuit. Instead, the individual's creative impulse towards the self manifests in bonds of solidarity which hold the community tight, like tree roots holding soil together. When medical systems fail us, we routinely develop our own DIY alternatives. When mental health institutions attack us, it is us who take up the reins to uplift one another. Within the queer community, the desire to be openly authentic to ourselves spurs on an enduring, determined hope. Hope not that our society will become less oppressive, but instead that we will become able to defy it when necessary. We find ourselves able to stand tall and defiant, beaming yet still with joy, no matter how tattered. As a community, we mourn for the dead. As a community, we fight for the living. But what exactly are we fighting for? To answer what we are fighting for, we must understand what we are up against. In the United States, we find ourselves crushed under a hierarchic structure. What is a hierarchy? We've mentioned it before. but it's a social system characterized by the oppression of people in order to enforce the empowerment of another set, whose methods are specifically built around power concentration or centralization, domination, and the exploitation of the oppressed mass to extract social and political influence, as well as monetary capital where it applies. Specifically, we are dealing with patriarchy, and by extension, every hierarchy in which patriarchy is entrenched within and works to uphold it. This brings us to the social system of mutually enforcing dominators, the Kyriarchy. To describe it, let's look at just one way to contextualize it. Capitalism, an economic hierarchy enforced by the state, a social hierarchy, empowered to repress non-patriarchal normative communities to make them easier to exploit for money and eliminate by patriarchy, discarding those who can no longer bear it, aka spent capital, via ableism, saneism, and neurotypical normativity. These structures combine together to form what we're trying to describe here, which is an interlocking system designed to remove your ability to empower yourself upon different axes until you are thoroughly atomized. Patriarchy finds itself enshrined in legal codes such as family codes, i.e., what defines marriage? What is the legal status of a child? What powers do parents and guardians have over them? And what is done with parents and children who are no longer of capacity to be exploited? Dress codes and decency laws exist to systematically bury any attempts to express one's gender and sexuality in a manner not permitted by the hierarchy. Meanwhile, the youth are quite literally considered property of the parent. In schooling institutions, the creative impulse is beat out of children, and they are forced by social pressures, by mentors and fellow students, to intuit their own oppression as natural, to mask their uniqueness, to conform. Children who come out as trans are reported to their parents in some states and counties, where they may face enormous consequences for their bravery. Many parents would simply their children rather be dead than queer. Some still are willing to make good on that desire. Companies, meanwhile, support eliminationist policies, discriminate against queer people, and systematically impoverish the intersectional working class as a whole. Which, in the queer experience, means we cannot obtain the capital necessary to practically make good on our supposed freedoms. In essence, although we have a set of negative freedoms, society shall not do this to us, we, in practice, have no freedoms, because we do not possess the ability to actually enact them. And all this occurs while states like Texas wield the power to steal children from what families are accepting, and they have the gall to say it's for our own benefit. This tendency to control another's life, especially in the parental way, is fundamentally a patriarchal impulse. And that interlocking structure, how the state interacts with it, how deprivation of capital reduces our freedoms to almost none, is exactly what the Kyriarchy is. Furthermore, rape culture, toxic masculinity, religious inclinations, harassment all serve as formal and informal means to control where the state cannot reach, and compounding oppression where it can't. And, of course, I must say a disclaimer, not all religious inclinations are oppressive or patriarchal, but the dominant ones that we find ourselves in are. On top of all of this, the Christian church at large continually pushes for a traditional, queer-denying spiritual and political outlook, weaponizing guilt and mobilizing a radical emergence of patriarchal norms to crush the community as a whole. We see this in the rise of Christo-fascism. That is what we are up against, what American society demands we submit to. This totalizing repression leads us to what we're fighting for, and it's largely an anarchic point of view. If to be queer is to rebel against conformity and seek the authentic anti-patriarchal self, then it is only reasonable that we would find ourselves in a fight against social hierarchies which seek to coerce our conformity and silence the self. The anarchist finds themselves in a pitched battle against oppression, with goals of autonomy and freedom. This tendency, of course, is not unique to queer people, and is in fact common against all people who defy their oppressors. But it cannot be understated the degree to which the anarchist movement in the United States is queer, and the degree to which the queer community marries those anarchic tendencies and tactics. Their convergent evolutions are, after all, a product of the same conditions. And while society demands of us to conform or die, we demand justice, bodily autonomy, and morphological freedom. We demand stability. We demand the right to exist. And such a right cannot be granted by oppressors, just as a bullet cannot give life and shade cannot produce light. It must be taken. That is what we are fighting for. With all that context in mind, a basic understanding of the broad, though not universal, tendencies which help define the queer community, that is to say our culture of resistance, communality, and dignity, and what we are up against, i.e. the patriarchy and Kyriarchy it is part of, where do we go from here? To quote a rather unappealing man, what is to be done? The answer lies in two strategies: a creative process and a destructive process. Revolution and insurrection. Revolution is the process by which we create new social relations. By social relations, I mean the bonds we create, meaning familial and post-familial systems of kinship, methods of organizing our labor, means by which we assemble to conduct politics, and the intentional acting on our physical and social spaces, our institutions, beliefs, spiritualities, etc. In short, our entire social, interpersonal, and political realities. This process includes abolition, or systemic ending, of any oppressive systems which impede our ability to freely form new, hospitable worlds for us to inhabit. Such a process is not limited to the queer community, and must be intersectional to gain the strength to overcome those obstacles noted above. That means that the queer struggle must stand with the Black, Brown, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous struggles. They must stand with the worker struggle, the struggle for sovereignty, for autonomy. They must stand for the climate struggle, as no political reality matters if we have no world to enjoy it on. Freedom without climate justice is simply the freedom to die, after all. As for our part, it means organizing against the growing surge of fascism. Community defense groups, specific anti-hierarchical political organizations, abortion, HRT, and PrEP collectives, establishing a network of medical professionals willing to aid us in transition, police abolition to hamper the state's ability to practically enact genocide upon us and attack the people as a whole. We can look towards the practices of a narco-syndicalist, a specificist anarchist, queer and feminist collectives in Mexico, the anti-fascist movement as a whole, Stop Cop City, and more. Unionizing our workplaces and places we rent to provide us a measure of stability to enact broad-scale political changes and siphon money from those who wish to impoverish us is just one example as well. Building up community spaces where we can be freely joyful and queer, where we can meet new people and find safety in our collective arms. Teach one another how to perform trade tasks to reduce the cost of living and increase our sense of control over our own lives. These are all examples of the revolutionary process we must be willing to enact if we are to stop our own eradication, if we are to free ourselves from this inhospitable condition we find ourselves slaved to. On the other hand, we have insurrection. Insurrection is defined by the destruction or total negation of oppressive forces and dismantling of their power centers. In practice, this can be seen in protest and protest's climax, the riot, such as in the 2020 George Floyd uprising. It can be seen in informal organizing against fascism in the form of affinity groups, militias, and individual acts of resistance. And while I cannot, disclaimer obviously, publicly support such actions as a totally law-abiding citizen, such things necessarily rise when a community faces overwhelming brutality. With this knowledge equipped, what can you do? Start with your friends, with people you meet. Get connected to activist spaces. Research anarchism, abolition, and queer feminism. Learn all you can about what it takes to become ungovernable. Take local action. Use flyers to lambast transphobes in the community or promote food distributions. Create reading groups to advance each other's education. Go to the gun range of other queer people you know. Distribute reading material and food to your local community. Table at punk shows at parks. Create events amongst each other. Look up how to form community land trusts and building common housing. Unionize everything. Is some necessity too expensive in your area? Then form a worker cooperative or an organization to meet that need. Find each other. Design everything horizontally. That is to say, against hierarchy. This is just a taste of the power that you hold. Contrary to what politicians tell us, we are so much more powerful than a vote could ever contain. And no amount of voting is going to free us. We are going to have to free ourselves. Thank you so much for watching this whole video. While we touched on what you can do there at the end, in the following videos we will begin a deep dive on what those actions actually entail. I hope you found this video educational, helpful, or whatever you need it to be, honestly. If you want to support my channel, you can sign up for my Patreon. You'll find the link in the description and pinned in the comments. Giving more money doesn't give any special privileges, as I think education should be free. However, whatever you can spare per month would do wonders to enable me to devote myself full time to this and other activist work. The result would be a shorter downtime between videos, and the videos that are put out within that time frame being higher quality. With that, I'll let you know when the next video is coming out. I'm thinking of streaming a video soon, maybe in a few weeks or so. Let me know what you think. And of course, please comment down below what you thought about the video, critiques, additions you would make, or just to say hello. I would rather this be the start of a conversation than the end of one. I also read every comment you all send, though obviously if you say something shitty, I'm not gonna respond. Trolls on the internet can cope and seethe. With all that in mind, follow me on my socials for more news, and I'll see you next time we go down the rabbit